Hello and welcome to EPG Pathshala. This is Stuti Goswami. The module that I am going to speak on today is module number 16, Women and Pacifism. Gender, we have to understand at the outset, is a very important aspect of discussions, any discussions on pacifism, because conflict ultimately is a gendered activity. Men and women have an equally important role to play when it comes to conflict and finding solutions to conflict. But it is also a fact that for the longest period of time, discussions of women and conflict have pivoted around women as victims, that is, on the victimhood aspect of women. But then, women can play and has a very crucial role to play as peacemakers, and that is what this module seeks to look at. In fact, there are several reasons for which it is the need of the hour that there should be a significant number of women peacemakers associated with the various peacemaking activities across the world. That would be discussed subsequently. However, at the outset, let me give this figure that in 1993, only 1% of the deployed peacekeeping personnel were women. From that, in 2014, 3% of military and 10% of police personnel associated with UN peacekeeping activities were women. So this shows that the number of women peacekeepers has increased. It is just that the number has to increase because it is so very necessary. And we have scope to believe that the number of women peacekeepers will definitely increase with time. For this, it is extremely important that a paradigm shift takes place wherein both men and women begin to accept and believe that women can play a significant role in peacekeeping and peace-building activities. Now let us look at a few aspects or few areas on which women as peacekeepers have a very significant role to play. The first is gaining access to information. Women are often seen to be extremely vulnerable to violence in armed conflict. And therefore, it is necessary that there are women peacekeepers, because women would be naturally more comfortable or more at ease talking about their traumatic experiences with other women. And this actually helps in gathering not only important information but also significant insight into the conflict zone, and this in turn again helps in finding out solutions to those problems in those conflict zones. Secondly, the medical aspect. A woman victim of conflict will have gynecological or medical issues that need to be addressed. Now, that woman or those women may not be comfortable talking about their gynecological issues or those aspects in front of male peacekeepers, and this is true particularly in conservative societies. In such a situation, a woman peacekeeper has a very, very important role to play. Thirdly, what we have to mention is DDR, or disarmament, demobilization and reintegration. Now, these are extremely crucial in terms of finding solutions to conflict zones and war, because we have to remember that women and even children are involved in conflict or war not simply or not always as victims but also as combatants or propagators of violence. And this is either voluntary or, as it happens in most cases, forced. Now, these women and these young children can be helped to come back to mainstream, or can be helped to come back to normal lives, and in this whole reintegration to society, a woman peacekeeper has or can play a very important role. Because women peacekeepers can handle children and other women victims or women combatants with a lot of sensitivity and empathy, and that is very, very necessary or very crucial when it comes to peacekeeping activity and peace building activities. In this context, we have to remember that women peacekeepers are given specialized training so that they can help rehabilitate and reintegrate sufferers of conflict and war in post-conflict situations. Now, this training not only enhances the communication skills of the peacekeepers, which is anyway a prerequisite, but also this training makes the peacekeepers aware of the social, cultural, historical and political background of that particular community or affected by conflict or war. And this is very important because it helps not only prevent further conflict, but it also helps find solutions to those conflict, those problems, various problems associated with the conflict. Now, the next area in which women peacekeepers have a very important role to play is prevention of child trafficking and women trafficking. Now, in any war zone or in any conflict area, gender-based violence is extremely common, and what is more worrisome is that it is not only extremely common but also it is often used, gender-based violence is often used as a strategic or political tool to not simply intimidate or terrorize a population but also for the mere sake of pleasure, and this is again very important. And therefore, women and children, even men, but women and children are extremely vulnerable to sexual exploitation and sexual violence in any conflict area. And where there is sexual exploitation, there are concomitant issues like post-traumatic stress disorder, pregnancy, and sexually transmitted diseases. Now, these again need to be addressed properly through proper medical guidance and at the same time with a lot of empathy, because women, when they go through traumatic experiences like sexual slavery, sexual exploitation or strip searches also, they become extremely emotionally and mentally vulnerable, and in that situation a woman peacekeeper has a very important role to play. There is another aspect to the threat of child trafficking and women trafficking in a conflict area. Because of conflict, and when we say conflict, we have to understand it could be insurgency, it could be ethnic strife, it could be terrorism, among others. And in any conflict zone, the first casualties are the social security, the social framework, along with the economic condition. And these three, individually or collectively, make women and even children extremely vulnerable to poverty and trafficking. Now, in this, we also have to remember that in any of these conflict zones, there are already certain laws of the land at work. But whenever there is conflict, or whenever there is a situation of conflict, what happens is that those laws are merely on paper. And so, women and children, who become so vulnerable to trafficking, enter this vicious cycle. Another important, and it is not only important, but it is very, very worrisome aspect related to this is the complicity of UN peacekeepers. In fact, over the years, there have been a number of allegations on UN male peacekeepers of being not simply complicit to, or not simply turning a deaf ear and a blind eye to such cases or concerns of child and women trafficking, but of they themselves being involved directly or indirectly in such activities. Now, the presence of female peacekeepers in conflict zones, it is believed, ensures controlling of or lessening the number of cases of sexual abuse, sexual exploitation and child trafficking in any part of the world. And therefore, it is very important to have women peacekeepers or women peacekeeping units in conflict zones. In fact, the historic United Nations Resolution 1325 has mandated that there should be female peacekeepers attached to all peacekeeping missions all over the world whenever there is a conflict zone. Of course, this resolution would be taken up for discussion in a subsequent module, but here we just have to remember that, or we just have to keep in mind that the United Nations over the last decade or so has sought to ameliorate these issues, these crucial issues of trafficking and exploitation through complicity of the UN peacekeepers through such resolutions. Now, when we come to some of the incentives for women peacekeepers, then we can pinpoint 5. And these actually have been spoken about by the scholar Francesco Bertolazzi in his essay Women with a Blue Helmet, the Integration of Women and Gender Issues in UN Peacekeeping Missions. Now, what are those? The first is career. So, according to Bertolazzi, being involved in peacekeeping units or peacekeeping missions can be an attractive and a good career option for women, because it gives them an exposure of different, because it gives them exposure of a different kind altogether. Secondly, economic benefits, which is self-explanatory, I believe. Thirdly is altruistic. The satisfaction that is derived out of helping people in trouble, helping suffering people, can be extraordinary, and therefore women peacekeepers can have this. Along with economic incentives, they can also derive the satisfaction of helping people in need, and this is also important. Number 4 is sharing experiences and meeting persons from other countries. This can also be called, in a way, this can also be called a form of cultural exchange, where a UN peacekeeper from one part of the world engages in peacekeeping activity in another part of the world, and that way, through the rapport that she strikes with the local population, she can not only learn about another culture, the people of that culture also get to learn about that woman and the culture that she comes from. Fifthly is the opportunity to work and live in a demanding international environment. However, in spite of these incentives, many women are reluctant to join the UN peacekeeping forces, and three major reasons for these could be: firstly, managing the family or family life, because all families may not be as supportive of a woman peacekeeper leaving her family in a particular place and going and working in some other place. Secondly is sexual harassment. Important to remember that not only are women victims of conflict vulnerable, but even if to a lesser extent, women peacekeepers are also vulnerable at times to sexual harassment in the peacekeeping units where they work. And thirdly, of course, is gender discrimination. We have to understand that the involvement of women peacekeepers is generally at the civilian or the civil military level, where they are basically expected to be involved in communication and such other activities, instead of being involved in direct or more field-based operations. So this is another factor that probably weans women away from being involved in peacekeeping activities. But still, of course, the Department of Peacekeeping Operations, or DPKO, has developed a gender approach, and they are constantly trying to recruit more and more women as peacekeepers in the peacekeeping missions. Now we come to the idea of pacifism. This term was coined for the first time by the French peace campaigner Émile Arnaud, and it was adopted at the 10th Universal Peace Congress held at Glasgow in the year 1901 by the peace activists. Of course, different definitions of pacifism have been offered. And yet, in spite of all these definitions, I think the basic idea is that pacifism means a belief that all war is morally wrong and that disputes should be settled by peaceful means. Therefore, pacifism. Of course, we also have to understand that there is a difference, there is a basic difference between pacifism and the more general commitment to non-violence from a narrower anti-war position. Pacifism is also further defined through its dialectical relation to the idea of justified violence that is often found in the Western just war tradition. In fact, there has been in recent times a constant debate about the proper relation between just war theory and pacifism that focuses on the question of whether the just war theory begins with a pacifist assumptions against war. Of course, before we proceed, I think a couple of lines about just war. Basically, just war is theory, or just war is a principle that seeks to justify war. It not simply as just as the term implies, but also as a last resort. In fact, just war theorists or supporters of this theory believe that war, if waged because of some legitimate reason, can be justified. And in this, the biggest flaw probably is that they tend to overlook the casualties and the damages that take place due to war. But that is another matter. Now, when we come to women and pacifism, now because of their childbearing quality or capacity rather, and their ability to nourish life, women are seen as naturally inclined towards, or women are seen to have a natural inclination towards peaceful or peacemaking activities. And therefore, many seek to look at motherhood as inherently endowing women with an inclination for peace and a preoccupation with caring for others. But as many critics of this idea would say, this is quite self-defeatist in nature. In fact, many feminist critics even say that that motherhood, the peacefulness and the role of women as caregivers do not justify women's exemption from conscription or being involved in national armed forces and accessing military position in many countries, issues that have always been subject to debates. And like I have already mentioned, many feminists view this whole idea of motherhood as simply as caregiving or or this childbearing quality of motherhood to be self-defeatist, and also not only that, they also like to see it as problematic and counterproductive, because what happens is the moment a woman is seen only as a mother who gives birth to a child, who nourishes a life, that at once limits the woman's role and overlooking all her merits and capabilities into certain limited categories. Of course, anti-war feminism is significant in this context because anti-war feminists, of course, they are totally opposed to this whole idea of pacifism. In fact, a couple of lines about anti-war feminism also would be noteworthy in this context. So anti-war feminism opposes war making as a practice, and it seeks to replace war with non-violent forms of protest, with contest and reconciliation instead of waging war. Anti-war feminists basically oppose to war on pragmatic and moral grounds because they keep the destruction aspect of war in perspective. And here I would like to quote a couple of lines from Carol Cohn and Sara Ruddick's working paper titled "A Feminist Ethical Perspective on Weapons of Mass Destruction." And I quote, "War is a source of enormous individual suffering and loss. Modern warfare is also predictably destructive to societies, civil liberties and democratic processes and the non-human world." So this quote itself shows the point that I had been trying to make a while ago. Before we conclude, I think it is pertinent to quote a few lines from an essay jointly written by 4 women of the Nyaleb Community Development Alliance in northeastern part of the Democratic Republic of Congo. These ladies are Ellen Adokorak, Mama Mado Beriu, Unwanga Jienet, and Biwaga Tabu. Now, and I quote, "Peace does not imply a situation where there is no war, but it symbolizes nourishment for one's soul and that of others. Peace is a situation or a state of non-violent living. It is not just the absence of war and tension, and it encompasses the existence of freedom of expression and interpersonal harmony that fosters social justice. A community is considered to be peaceful when all the people are free to engage in the development of themselves in the way they want without having to struggle for their rights and privileges." I think this quote itself highlights how important it is to have peace, or to find solutions of peace in any conflict situation. Finally, there is this quote by Jean MUNRO from Gender and Peace Building that is significant in this context. "One of the reasons that men and women have different approaches is derived from the perception that men in relation to women are the warriors, while women in relation to men are the peacemakers. War and peace situations often enhance traditional perceptions of men and women, where men are perceived as the aggressor, protector, killer, and women play the opposite role of pacifist, caregiver, and the protected." Now, from this we also understand that war becomes a tool or a medium that seeks to establish or underline the binary between men and women that exist. During the First World War, we see the emergence of the women's pacifist movement, of which Jane Addams is a very important name. She was famous for her social work, and she formed peace parties, of which the Women's Peace Party is significant. However, what is interesting about the women's pacifist movement of the First World War and Women's Peace Party and its activities is that they used a gendered language. And in other words, what they did was they ended up articulating Victorian gender ideals. And many a time they were idealists too. In the 1980s, in the aftermath of the second wave feminism of the 1960s and 70s, there were new theories of peace that came up. Two very important figures of this period would be Lucy Irigaray and Sara Ruddick. They criticized the masculinization of warfare. The emergence of postmodernism also witnessed a change in the dynamic of women and pacifism and women pacifist movements. Post-structuralism, for instance, rejected such binaries as male and female and war and peace. And what the pacifist feminist critics of this period believed was that the whole idea of women being inherently peaceful was to be absolutely or entirely rejected, because it was not simply regressive and restrictive, but it was also defeatist. And this is interesting because over the last few decades, this whole debate has reached a new level where on one hand, we have advocates of acceptance of gender difference, and on the other, we have those who do not accept such difference and they believe that such difference of gender is culturally determined or a cultural construct. Now, if we are to look at a few important or famous women pacifists, we can definitely take the name of the Japanese multimedia artist, singer and peace activist Yoko Ono. Again, we can also take the name of the Burmese leader, the civil rights activist and the politician Aung San Suu Kyi. We can also take the name of Joan Baez, American activist, songwriter and musician, and Anna Politkovskaya, a Russian journalist, writer, human rights activist. Apart from these, there are a number of other famous women pacifists too. However, whenever we talk about women and pacifism and women and peacekeeping, it is a dismal picture when it comes to the United Nations itself. Although there have been resolutions that have sought to increase the number of women peacekeepers and women involved in peacekeeping activities, the number still has not risen as much. At the beginning, I had already mentioned that in 1993, 1% of uniformed personnel were women. In 2014, 3% of military and 10% of police personnel were women in the UN peacekeeping forces. In 2017, till this year, it is a sad fact that less than 4% of soldiers and 10% of police deployed in the UN missions are women. So we see that the figures have not really changed much, and the UN itself, as the flag bearer of peace and peaceful activities, has not been able to live up to its own pledge. And at 22%, women are still quite underrepresented, particularly at the senior levels. However, the fact that the new Secretary General of the United Nations, Antonio Guterres, has appointed a gender parity task force as well as had the senior women talent pipeline reopened are significant developments. In fact, soon after his appointment, the Secretary General had appointed 3 women to important positions, including his deputy Amina Mohammed of Nigeria. Now, although these can be seen as positive developments in the direction of peacekeeping and peace-building activities, particularly in the context of United Nations, we also have to accept that the number have to increase with time. To sum up, in this module, we have seen how conflict is a gender activity and sustainable peace is possible only through gender equality. Secondly, we have also seen how women play a crucial role in peacekeeping and peace-building activities across the world. Thirdly, we have also seen how discussion of women in conflict situation often tends to focus on women as victims instead of looking at women in a more proactive role. Fourthly, we have touched upon the general inclination of viewing women as having a natural inclination towards peacemaking because of their capacity of creating and nourishing life, which of course has been widely criticized by various quarters. And finally, we have seen how despite a few positive changes in the direction of increasing participation of women in peacekeeping activities in the UN missions, there is still much more scope for improvement. But yes, we can definitely end with a hopeful note that this situation is going to improve with time. Thank you.